Translator Henyi Translations. Editor Henyi Translations. In the bitter air of Cold City, where spear banners snapped like thunderclouds and grudges were sharper than steel, a scene unfolded so absurd that even seasoned cultivators forgot to breathe. Peng! A blur of fur and fury, Rabbit, shot through the wind like a missile loosed from a Divine Dao. It didn't merely collide with the 8th Elder of the Southern Spear Association. It slammed straight into his face with the kind of vicious precision that made onlookers' jaws drop. And the humiliation did not stop at impact. Rabbit's 4 paws hovered for the briefest heartbeat, as if gathering momentum. And then, like a storm of talons, he raked and clawed wildly across the 8th Elder's face. In an instant, the old man's features were carved with fresh scratch marks, and blood flowed without pause, turning his dignity into a public spectacle. The crowd that had been watching fell into a stunned silence. At the very least, the Northern Spear Association already knew Hu Nu was terrifyingly strong. So strong it made common logic kneel. But no one, not even them, could have imagined that even a rabbit at her side could be this outrageous. So outrageous that it could reduce the 8th Elder, an elite of the Heaven Tier, into something so pitiful, so pathetic, so openly disgraced. Then, as if the heavens themselves were playing a joke, Rabbit straightened up and began inspecting himself from head to toe. He released a long breath, patted his own chest with lingering fear, and spoke out loud. Clear as day, human as any man. Ah, scared Lord Rabbit to death. Thankfully, I was not injured. The scene instantly irritated everyone. Of course you weren't hurt. 8th Elder was the one bleeding and battered. And worse, this was a Heaven Tier powerhouse being humiliated in full view of all, made into a laughingstock in public. It was horrible. It was despicable. And on top of that, how could a rabbit open its mouth and speak? The 8th Elder trembled from head to toe, anger shaking him like a leaf in a tempest. He raised a finger that quivered violently and pointed at Hu Nu, so furious he could barely form words. His breath became ragged, his chest heaving, as though the shame itself was strangling him. He looked ready to pass out on the spot. For someone like him, a Heaven Tier elite, to end up like this, scratched, bleeding, mocked by a talking beast, was an insult that scraped bone. But Rabbit wasn't done rubbing salt into the wound. You what? Rabbit snapped back, glaring with exaggerated ferocity. This Lord Rabbit hasn't even complained yet. Old fart, your face was tough as iron, nearly snapped this Lord Rabbit's claws. Can you afford to compensate me? In that instant, the 8th Elder's hatred shifted like a spear tip turning toward a new target. This rabbit, this cursed rabbit, carried taunting attributes of its own. The moment it opened its mouth, it provoked people into madness. Die, the 8th Elder roared. He surged forward and threw out a slap aimed directly at Rabbit. Fast, ruthless, the kind of strike meant to end life without discussion. Rabbit's courage evaporated like mist under sun. Little ancestor, help, it screamed. After all, Rabbit was only in the deity transformation tier. Yes, it possessed an extraordinary bloodline, and that was precisely why it had been able to injure the 8th Elder earlier with those savage claws. But now, in a direct clash, how could it possibly contend with a Heaven Tier elite face-to-face? It turned and ran. Shoo! In a flash, Rabbit was already hiding behind Hu Nu. Then, shameless to the extreme, it poked its head out again, pointed a claw at the 8th Elder, and shouted with full confidence in someone else's fists. Little ancestor, hit him! Hu Nu's eyes lit up. She rolled up her sleeves as if preparing to knead dough rather than fight a Heaven Tier Elder. Fighting and brawling. This was what she loved most. The 8th Elder's slap cut through empty air. Missing his mark, he twisted around at once and drove a punch toward Hu Nu instead. No restraint. No hesitation. That punch exploded with endless brilliance, and from it surged a martial intent so fierce and domineering it felt like a blade storm spilling out of his meridians. The sheer force carried the authority of a Heaven Tier elite enraged beyond reason, and in his shame-born fury he no longer cared that this was Cold City. He unleashed his full strength without regard for the consequences. In that moment he wanted only one thing, to annihilate everyone present, to erase all witnesses, so that no one, ever again, would be able to speak of how he had been humiliated today. Hong! The strike arrived. Terrifying, crushing, heavy enough to make the air itself seem to crack. Who knew, however, did not dodge in panic. She reached behind her back, grabbed Rabbit as casually as one might grab a troublesome pouch, lifted him up, and flung him forward, straight at the Eighth Elder, like a living weapon. "Fuck!" Rabbit wailed mid-flight. "Why is it Lord Rabbit again?" Peng! Rabbit smashed into the Eighth Elder's face a second time. Because of that powerful bloodline, because his body was not like an ordinary rabbit's fragile shell, the collision still carried enough force to send the Eighth Elder reeling. The Heaven-tier Elder became disoriented, dizzy, his senses briefly thrown into chaos. But that dizzy moment was only the beginning. Shua! 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 Rabbit's claws lashed out again. Madly, relentlessly, carving fresh marks across the Eighth Elder's face once more. Then, the instant the claws finished their vicious dance, Rabbit fled away at full speed, refusing to remain for the inevitable retaliation. The Eighth Elder staggered, nearly choking on rage. You! He gasped, pointing shakily at Who Knew and Rabbit, his breath suddenly failing him again as if his lungs had turned to ash. His steps faltered, his body swayed, and then he stumbled and collapsed onto the ground. The members of the Southern Spear Association rushed forward immediately, forming a circle around him, calling out anxiously. But as they checked his condition, their alarm twisted into something stranger, something almost unreal, until one after another they cried out with disbelief. The Eighth Elder has passed out. To them, a Heaven-tier elite was the most invincible, the most unmatched existence under the heavens. And yet here was their Eighth Elder, fainted from anger. Fainted because of a few tricks from a little girl? And a talking rabbit. Who could accept that? The entire sequence of events felt like a dream, an impossible, ridiculous dream that had somehow become reality in broad daylight. Kek! Who Knew clutched her sides and roared with laughter, clapping her hands with genuine enthusiasm. This is fun! Really fun! Who will we play with next? Her gaze drifted lazily, back and forth, between the Third Elder and the Fourth Elder of the Southern Spear Association, as if choosing her next toy. Those two old men felt pressure slam down on them like a mountain. They had watched Who Knew's earlier attack with their own eyes. There was no trickery, no profound mystery, nothing fancy at all. It was simply fast. Yet that speed was precisely what made their hearts pound so violently. Old Eighth's strength was only slightly weaker than theirs. The gap between them wasn't large, and if either of them had been the one standing there earlier, they would have ended the same way. Ling Han, watching the farce unfold, let out a laugh, calm, cutting, confident. His eyes swept across the Southern Spear Association like a blade passing over grass. "Now," he said lightly, "is there still anyone who wishes to force me to change my name?" The members of the Southern Spear Association burned with anger, but not one dared to voice their resentment. Eighth Elder had already been driven into unconsciousness by humiliation and rage. And the other two elders, Third and Fourth, had suddenly become mute, as if their tongues had been sealed by fear. What more could anyone possibly say? Ling Han flicked his fingers. Decisive. "Let's go! Let's go!" Who Knew echoed, hopping forward cheerfully. She reached out, grabbed Rabbit by his long ears, and dragged him along as though hauling a noisy banner. "Ah! You are abusing animals!" Rabbit screamed, protesting loudly as his body bounced along the ground. Nearby, Mu Feiyao stared with eyes widened to their limit, her face filled with disbelief. When she had first met Ling Han, he had been so weak that she could have crushed him with a single finger. Now? She had just stepped into the flower blossom tier, yet Ling Han had grown into a height she could only look up to, like someone staring at a peak swallowed by clouds. And as her thoughts drifted, another memory surfaced, one that made her cheeks warm in a slow-burning heat. She remembered being spanked by Ling Han before. Her pretty face flushed gradually, and even her behind seemed to grow a little itchy, as if the shameful echo of that moment refused to fade. Time flowed, and Ling Han made his return to the capital of the Purple Moon Empire. This journey took nearly 10 days. By now, Maduo Bao should have already resolved the totem's problem, and should be on the verge of stepping into the final battle against the 5 great sects. Ling Han had no intention of missing such a spectacle. Sure enough, the moment he returned to the palace, a grand sight greeted him. Above the palace hung a sword's virtual image, sharp, solemn, and radiant. It was the totem. Ling Han could sense it clearly. This sword had already condensed a considerable amount of the people's will, faith, hope, shared desire, woven into power. That gathered force was already enough to suppress cultivators of the flower blossom tier. Truly astonishing. It had only been a few days. But then again, the Purple Moon Empire had been established far earlier than the Great Ling Empire. The purpose here was simple: to give the people a target, an object, something they could pour belief into. With such a foundation, condensing the power of the nation's hearts was naturally easy. In only a few days, the totem had climbed to a formidable height, and the middle state itself was vast. Its overall level of martial arts was also considerably high. If this continued, perhaps it would not take long before this totem could rival the Shattering Void tier. A familiar voice sighed nearby, half awe and half exhaustion. "Ho-ho, my tanned brother," Ma Duobao said, eyes fixed on the sword image above as though measuring the weight of a country. Just as I thought. After forming a real nation, with the middle state alone being so huge, it was almost enough to fill me to bursting point. Ling Han frowned slightly and turned toward him. "Brother Ma," he asked, "you have recultivated the body, but you still can't endure such a strong power of the nation?" Ma Duobao shook his head, and though his expression looked somewhat pitiful, his voice remained steady, like a man stating the limits of heaven's law. "How much power of the nation can be endured," he explained, "is determined by two aspects. One is your cultivation level. The other is whether you possess a tyrannically strong body." He lifted a hand, counting the facts as if tallying fate. "As for cultivation tier, I'm already at the 9th layer of the Shattering Void tier. It's impossible for me to advance further." Then he tapped his own chest with a dull thud. "And my body has reached level 10 precious metals toughness, but that's also the limit." He sighed again, the sound heavy. Yet in the next breath, his mood flipped. A smile appeared, bright, confident, full of gambler's spirit. "However," he said, "compared to the last time, the power of the nation I can accommodate this time has at least doubled. There should be a 30% chance of success to split open the sky. 30%. Only 30%. The words struck Ling Han harder than any spear thrust. He was shocked, first because of Ma Duobao's strength. This man's battle prowess was definitely more than 15 Starnzan stars, a monster among monsters. And his body, at level 10 precious metal toughness, made him practically invincible, without equal in this world. And yet, even with that kind of strength, that kind of body, and the added might of a nation, the success rate to split open the sky was still only 30%. It was astonishing. Ling Han's thoughts immediately turned inward. What if it were him? He calculated silently. If his cultivation could reach the Shattering Void tier, then his body would be able to step into the level of divine metal. At that point, the power of the nation he could accommodate would far exceed Ma Duobao's, and his martial prowess was not inferior in the slightest. So if the two of them were compared side by side, what would the rate of success be for him to split open the sky? Translator. Henyi Translations. Editor. Henyi Translations. Listen, within the ink of those ancient records, when the skies themselves became a chessboard, Ling Han finally let his gaze sharpen into a blade. He turned to Ma Duobao and spoke in a tone that sounded half like a warning, half like a vow. If this matter truly could not be accomplished in time, then why not hand it to him? As he said it, he lifted his hand and sliced across the air with a decisive gesture, as if he meant to carve a wound straight through the heavens. But this was no childish boast, no casual talk of ripping open the sky. To split the firmament was to challenge the will of heaven and earth themselves. For heaven and earth possessed spirit, an existence akin to an independent body, whole and self-contained. And as long as that truth remained, the world would not tolerate the fusion of another body into itself, not even if the intent was to raise and elevate it. It was the stubborn logic of a ruler who would rather sit upon a throne in the underworld than bow beneath another's roof. Better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. Yes, it was possible that splitting the sky might succeed. Yet what if it failed? If it failed, it would awaken the fury of heaven and earth. The wrath would descend as thunder punishment, and the perpetrators would be struck down by lightning. Otherwise, how could the Purple Moon Empire of the past have been shattered and erased? The lesson had already been written in blood and ash. And still, if the worst happened, could they not retreat, wait for a time, and attempt it again? Once, twice, again and again. Until perhaps, in a single attempt, fortune finally tilted and success was seized. Then came the cold, heavy thought that lingered beneath it all. When those beings slept, they would slumber for several millennia at a time. Perhaps that was not mere laziness. Perhaps it was their method, hiding themselves within time itself, waiting until heaven and earth's vengeance cooled, waiting until the world forgot the taste of anger. Ma Duobao listened, his expression unmoved. Then he slowly shook his head, the flesh of his cheeks barely quivering with emotion, and replied in a voice calm enough to chill a flame. There was not enough time left for them. If they waited until the upper realm showed signs of movement, until the heavens above stirred, then they would lose the initiative completely. They would become the ones reacting, scrambling, forever one step behind, because the immortals would descend when it came time to refine the realm pill. And though the immortals who descended would be suppressed to the shattering void tier, their battle prowess would still be terrifying beyond reason. To kill them would be, for all practical purposes, impossible. Now imagine that scene. The battlefield churning, countless experts charging and clashing, the air thick with bloodlust and spiritual radiance. How, in the midst of such chaos, would anyone find the stillness and precision to split open the sky? Ling Han gave a slow nod, the weight of it settling into his bones. Time. What they lacked was not courage, not strength, not even ruthlessness. What they lacked was time. The record even carried a small, strange stamp in the middle of this grim discussion. You're reading on, calm thanks. As if the world itself had briefly winked before returning to the knife's edge. When the next day arrived, they pitched camp, gathered their forces, and pressed forward to meet the 5 great sects in open war. To mortals, the distance between the 5 great sects was absurd. Thousands upon thousands of miles, stretches of land that would swallow lifetimes. But in the eyes of shattering void tier giants, those distances were trivial, no more than a day's travel. Because of that, the 5 great sects stood close enough to support one another with ease. If one sect was threatened, the others could respond like linked blades. When Ma Duobao reached the front line, the remaining 7 kings had already assembled. They converged around him, joined forces with him and the Lunar King. And then the entire group set their heading, straight toward the Heaven's Sword Sect. It did not need to be spoken aloud. The decisive battle would be there. The elites of the 5 great sects would certainly gather within the Heaven's Sword Sect, consolidating their strength to clash head-on with the Purple Moon Empire. And among Ma Duobao's side, the names of the kings were a roll call of dread. There was the Heavenly Astral King. There was the Lunar King. There was the Flame King. And the remaining 5, the Great Water King, the Justice Mountain King, the Clear Solar King, the Pure Golden King, and the Opulent Peace King, marked with a small 1 in the old register, as if the chronicler had left a quiet footnote in the margin of fate. 8 in total. Each of these 8 kings was a shattering void tier elite with battle prowess reaching 15 stars, monsters of cultivation whose presence alone could bend the air. Their strength was not merely formidable, it was frighteningly absolute. As they advanced, of course, the Heaven Sword sect did not simply watch them stroll to the front gate. People came, again and again, trying to block their progress. Ambushes, interception squads, desperate stands made by those who hoped to slow the tide. Yet the 8 kings needed only to strike casually. A wave of power here, a dismissive blow there, and obstacles were swept aside like dry leaves in a storm. Step after step, they pressed forward toward the Heaven Sword sect's main gate, unstoppable as a mountain sliding down to crush a valley. Their party was not large, but it was sharp. Besides Ling Han's group of 3, Ma Duobao brought only the 8 kings and 1,000 elite troops. Only 1,000. Yet every single one of those 1,000 was a high-level heaven-tier cultivator. Not only that, they were trained in combined assaults through formation arts, moving as a single entity with layered coordination. Their collective battle prowess was sufficient to rival high-level shattering void-tier cultivators. 1,000 blades, arranged into one killing formation, Along the way, disciples of the Heaven Sword sect were defeated as the army advanced, their resistance broken one line at a time. Soon, sooner than their enemies likely wished, the Purple Moon Empire's force arrived before the Heaven Sword sect's main gate. And there, the path ended. They could not simply march through, because a protective formation stood in place, an invisible barrier of power, humming with the sect's foundation and pride. Pure Golden King stepped forward at once, impatience flashing behind his eyes. "Leave this to me," he declared, and his golden spear appeared in his hands like a ray of sunrise, forged into steel. He held the spear against his chest, steadying his breath. Then his eyes transformed, turning into two golden stars, bright and cold. At the spear's tip, power began to condense into a sphere of light. At first it was no larger than an egg, contained and trembling with pressure. He continued to compress it, pouring strength into it with relentless focus. The light ball grew, egg to fist, fist to melon, until it reached the size of a watermelon. And then, no matter how fiercely he tried, it would not expand further. It refused to grow even a fraction more, as if it had reached a limit that could not be surpassed by brute will alone. Ling Han watched this and felt his blood run cold. The aura packed inside that sphere was terrifying. If that strike was released, the destructive force would be beyond ordinary imagining. It reminded him of a technique, one of the 3 styles of Black Origin. The final style was named Breaking Limits. In Breaking Limits, one had to stand still, gathering strength for several minutes, building power without moving. Once unleashed, the attack would draw out the total strength of the cultivator's entire being in one eruption. In real battle, using such a move was practically the same as courting death, because while you stood still, your enemy would not politely wait. But against a protective formation, that was a different matter. To use such an approach to crack a defensive formation was clever, because a formation did not leap forward to kill you while you charged your strike, and here Pure Golden King had comrades guarding him. And truly, was there any defense in this world that could never be broken? No. There was no such thing as an unbreakable defense. If something did not break, it only meant one thing. The force used was not enough. That was why the name Breaking Limits was not empty boasting. It was an honest statement of the world's rules. Pure Golden King's method, though different in principle, would produce a similar outcome. He would never dare use such a slow-charging attack against an active enemy in the midst of battle. But with allies standing beside him, shielding him from interference, he had no fear of taking his time and gathering strength until his strike reached its peak. Minutes passed, at least 5 of them. Only then did Pure Golden King finally take a step forward. Yet with that single step, he crossed the distance as if the space itself had folded. Arriving directly before the defensive barrier, he raised his spear, aimed at the protective formation, and steadied his stance. Pooh! The spear tip pointed forward, and in the next instant, brilliance exploded outward, endless, violent radiance, so dazzling that those nearby could not even keep their eyes open. Boom! The ground shook underfoot. Heaven's Sword Mountain itself trembled, as though the very spine of the sect had been struck. The defensive barrier wavered, nearly collapsing, but in the end, it stabilized. It held. Pure Golden King, despite a strike condensed over 5 full minutes, still failed to blast through the protective formation. For a heartbeat, silence threatened to form. Then the other 7 kings burst into roaring laughter, laughing so hard that their dignity scattered. None of them bothering to maintain their grand image, they mocked him without mercy. One bellowed that the old 7th had clearly regressed. How could he fail to shatter a mere defensive formation with a single shot? Another sneered, asking if he had exhausted too much effort the night before. Another piled on, telling him that young men needed to learn restraint, and that he shouldn't spend all day doing those kinds of things. One after another, ridicule struck like thrown stones, and the Pure Golden King's face tightened with humiliation. Yet Pure Golden King did not explode in anger. Instead, his expression turned serious, his eyes narrowing as he evaluated what he had just felt. This formation, he admitted, was indeed far stronger than it had been the first time they came. Maduo Bao opened his mouth then, smoothly stepping in to rescue his trusted subordinate from drowning in mockery. This was normal, he explained. After all, After they had defeated it in the past, the 5 great sects would naturally have poured painstaking effort into strengthening the protective formation. With that in mind, it was only reasonable that his dear subject could not break through it in one strike now. Pure Golden King snorted, refusing to surrender his pride. It had only blocked one blow, he insisted. Let him try again, and within a single day, he would absolutely blast the formation down. But the Lunar King drifted forward then, swaying with effortless grace, her presence both beautiful and dangerous, like a flower with poison in its nectar. There was no time to waste on that. She said she would handle it. Pure Golden King bristled instantly, still clinging to his face-saving chance. Fourth sister, he protested. Let him do it? The Lunar King's smile softened, and that softness was precisely what made it frightening. What was this? She asked, amused. Did he think that because he had grown a little stronger, he could disobey her now? Should she properly teach him a lesson? As she spoke, she licked her red lips, her charming eyes half-lidded, yet the air around her felt like it carried a hidden blade. A dangerous aura spilled out, sweet and lethal. Pure Golden King visibly paled. No one should be fooled by the Lunar King's elegant posture and the alluring image she presented. Her temper was explosive. In the past, she had even dared to strike His Majesty himself. So what did that make Pure Golden King? Nothing more than an easy target. If he counted the number of beatings he had suffered at her hands before, it would probably become a lifelong trauma. He swallowed hard and backed down immediately. Fine, he conceded. Let her do it. And then, unexpectedly, Ma Duobao waddled out as well, big belly leading the way, smiling as if this was all a harmless banquet dispute. It was fine, he said, if they did not break the formation outright. They only needed to pass through it. Creating an opening would be enough. The Lunar King immediately opposed him, her brows lifting in disbelief. So they would have to squeeze in through a gap? Your Majesty, she complained. Your standard was far too low. One of the kings chimed in at once, agreeing. Boss, that wasn't domineering enough. Another echoed. Better to blast straight through. The others piled on with the same sentiment, the 7 kings adding their voices in support of greater spectacle and greater destruction. Ma Duobao continued smiling, amiable, gentle, his little eyes narrowing until they became crescent moons. Then he spoke softly, and the softness made the air go still. My beloved kings, he asked, do you harbor any dissatisfaction toward me? Instantly, the 8 kings' laughter died. Their bodies stiffened as if they had been splashed with icy water. They shook their heads so quickly it looked like their necks might snap, and answered in perfect unison. No, no, of course not, because they understood their boss well. Most of the time, Ma Duobao spoke with courtesy and warmth, sounding like a kindly ruler. But once he became serious, he was the kind of person who would destroy gods and knock down Buddha if they stood in his way. And from the very beginning, which of these kings had not been ruthless? Each was a fierce tyrant in his own right, yet all of them had still been beaten into submission by Ma Duobao. Ma Duobao nodded as if satisfied. Good, he said, still smiling. Then, with casual ease, he flicked and stroked his fingers through the air. Kwang! The defensive barrier of the formation instantly split, revealing a gap. Clean, decisive, carved open, as if the world's wall had been cut by an invisible blade. The opening was wide enough for the entire army to pass through without even slowing. So powerful, Ling Han stood there, dumbstruck in his heart. Pure Golden King had tried to shatter the entire protective formation. Ma Duobao only created a passage, and the difficulty between those 2 goals could not be compared. And yet, just a few casual finger strokes and such a result. It was enough to make anyone understand why Ma Duobao was the boss of the 8 kings. Ling Han lifted his head. Beyond that torn barrier, the Heaven's Sword sect was now close at hand, near enough to feel the chill of its blade-like aura on his skin.